Hello, Dankey Kang gang. It's Comrade Dankey here, and this is part 4 of our look into lived in lunacy. We'll just continue with the second half of this comment here. He says, as for the use of censorship, deplatforming, and violence by the left, I maintain it not only makes the left look just as radical and as terrifying as their enemies believe them to be, thus driving liberals and centrists further to the right and inhibiting the left from appealing to the numbers that they're going to need in order to facilitate any kind of socialist revolution. But the very practice of political violence is also antithetical to any kind of egalitarian system that a leftist group would want to create. Okay, so censorship, uh, advocating for certain uh, websites like YouTube or Facebook or Twitter to kick certain individuals off. I wouldn't say it constitutes as like censorship necessarily. I mean, after all, people are still able to go to their personal blogs or websites, such as Alex Jones InfoWars, and check out whatever kind of reactionary crap they have to say. So, and in terms of hardcore censorship, I mean, I want to see cases where conservatives have been censored where it hasn't been because they have been saying some really horrible hate speech. 99.9% of the time I've seen this, uh, it has always, whenever someone's saying, oh, I'm being censored by the left, when you look into it, it's because they've said some really horrible stuff. I mean, we can look at the PewDiePie controversy here on YouTube when PewDiePie said the N word. Everyone got really mad at him, and he said, I'm being attacked, I'm being censored by the left, they're trying to deplatform me, they're trying to silence me, ladies and gentlemen, and this is because they're jealous, because I represent the individual YouTuber and not big corporations and yada yada yada. And so we can sort of understand how these sort of alt-right groups and sympathizers use the claims of censorship and victimhood to sort of shield themselves from saying a lot of the horrible crap that they say, and it lets them get away with it. Because the second you try to call them out, they say, oh, are you trying to censor me? Are you trying to silence me, bro? And then, of course, deplatforming. Uh, you know, uh, like I said with Alex Jones, I mean, I think YouTube's a better place now that he's off of here and that his ideas don't have a higher likelihood of being spread to more people. And that's really what all this is about. Like, there's always going to be those ideas out there, whether it's coming from Alex Jones or from Glenn Beck or from some other just batshit lunatic. There's going to be somebody out there to fill that niche. But that being said, we don't have to grant them. There's nothing that says we must grant them a seat at the table. Uh, they can go eat on the floor like a dog. They can build their own table if they really, really want to. But there's also something to be said about these people who always talk about how the free market should dictate where we go. And they don't have qualms with private companies deciding to, cut their employees' benefits or, do whatever kind of anti-union bullshit they usually do. But they do have a problem with these private companies choosing to enforce their policies on hate speech. And when that happens, it's just kind of the ultimate hypocrisy, because it's like they're just doing what private corporations do, act like overlords. Maybe if YouTube was like a public domain website, then you could have an argument there, Alex Jones, but sorry. Um, and then, I mean, violence. Once again, this kind of goes back to my Antifa thing. Like, Antifa violence is not reactive violence. It's not proactive violence. We don't go out looking for just innocent people who are saying, we don't We're not like the language police that goes and looks for people who say the N-word and we say, "Hey, I'm going to, beat the shit out of you." That doesn't happen, folks. What happens with Antifa is uh usually somebody says, "Hey, some Nazis are going to be here." So a bunch of people go out there, sort of a loose coalition, can be leftists of all stripes, even liberals, who just go out there in case something happens, they will be able to defend whichever marginalized group is being threatened. And whenever fascists assemble in public in the street, like I said, it's a call for violence, it's a show of force, it's a way to intimidate whichever marginalized community they hate. And so we have to have a presence there, and it can't be a bunch of peace-loving hippies, because peace-loving hippies versus Nazis lose, my friend. The Nazis will punch them in the face and kick them and stomp them into the dirt. So we have to be prepared for a fight, not going there wanting a fight, but nevertheless being prepared. And I think anything in leftist praxis that says we shouldn't be prepared to fight and confront fascists directly in the street, I think is ultimately not constructive. It's like saying we should just let them walk all over us and just do nothing. And it's to draw back to a recent example here in Tennessee, when some of the Knoxville Pride leadership said, "We will kick out anybody in the parade that engages with the fascists in defense. We're just going to take the high road here and ignore them." Well, sorry, friends, you can't just ignore people who want you dead, want you in a gas chamber. And so that, if anything, that would just embolden them. It's kind of like those parents that say, "Now, if the bully picks on you, just ignore him." It's like, that's not how bullying works. It's designed to be in your face, so it bothers you. You can't just ignore it. And in the same way, like telling leftists not to be violent, telling leftists not to do defensive violence in retaliation to fascism, it is like saying, it's taking away the left's capacity to fight back. Because, like I said before, the fascists, they're not interested in the marketplace of ideas. They don't care about having a discussion. All of that marketplace of free ideas stuff is just a cloak to get them through the door. It's like the marketplace of ideas is a booty club, and they have to flash the free speech card so that the bouncer lets them in. Uh, and as far as it makes the left look as radical, as terrifying as their enemies believe them to be, I mean, just look at all the hysteria that was generated around Black Lives Matter. Look at all the hysteria generated around Antifa today. When was the last mass shooting that Antifa committed? Where was the last bombing that Antifa committed? I don't see any of that stuff happening in the name of Antifa because it has no place in anti-fascist tactics or action. But nevertheless, we've seen just the conservative and even the liberal news outlets totally throw Antifa under the bus and frame them as these just giant evil terrorist organization that just goes out looking for anybody that they disagree with, and they are just totally heavy-handed in their branding of everybody's a fascist. And that's not true, guys. I think any Antifa you talk to understands that there's a difference between a liberal and a fascist. Liberals enable fascists, but it doesn't make them so. Doesn't make them a fascist. Just makes them a useful patsy for one. And as far as like this sort of Antifa, I guess pro-fascist propaganda, if you could call it that, because two negatives do make a positive after all. So it's pro-fascist propaganda. trying to demonize the Antifa movement, it's always going to be there. It's always going to be channeled by the conservative media and parroted and puppeted uh, by the liberal media. And so, you know, as far as making us look bad, congratulations, they did it, and they're always going to do it. Even if we were a totally peaceful movement, which we largely are, we're only violent like in retaliation. So even if we were like just super duper peaceful, totally dedicated to peace, flower carrying hippies, they will still find a way to make us look like scary, Al Qaeda terrorists. So there's always going to be a certain part of the liberal and centrist reactionary like subsection of those groups that just eats this shit up and hook, line, and sinker, and they just uh, they take the bait, basically. They take the bait and they buy into this bullshit, capitalist media that tells them anti-fascism is bad and the real fascism. Meanwhile, it, tells them to just ignore the absolute atrocities committed by the US government abroad and domestically every day. So, this, you say this inhibits the left, but in my mind, anti-fascist action doesn't inhibit the left, and in my opinion, it strengthens the left, because anyone who cringes at the thought of anti-fascist action isn't really worth having on the left in the first place. It's like, if you're not going to fight against the Nazis of all people, then how can you be expected to fight against the big capitalists? How can we expect any kind of legitimate revolutionary momentum to come about from people who think that fascists deserve a seat at the table, let alone like a liberal bourgeois democracy? Um, so that's part of my approach. It's part of the Marxist-Leninist analysis. You have to have a strong vanguard party of class-conscious individuals leading the revolution, um, because you can't really rely on the liberals and centrists to listen to reason. People, unfortunately, tend to be reactionary. They tend to be emotional. They tend to just go wherever the wind blows, folks, and they listen to the mainstream media. They buy into all the bullcrap that the establishment tells them, and they don't really question it because they're comfortable. They're comfortable and feeling secure that they know what's true. Let's see. So I mean, yeah, part of the whole like Vanguard Party thing. To understand that, you might have to read a little bit more about Leninism and Lenin. But the whole point of having a vanguard party is to have a very strong central nucleus of just ideologically pure, class conscious, dedicated revolutionaries to lead the proletarian movement, to lead the charge, ladies and gents. And the other point of view, like the Trotskyist point of view, the Menshevik point of view, was no, we should have a movement that has all encompassing all the huge breadth and range of the leftist ideas. So anarchists, social democrats, even um, people who, like Trotsky and the Mensheviks. And so you had all of these people who were essentially reactionaries because they, anytime like a legitimate proletarian revolution came around, they would say, well, no, we can't have that because you also need to capitulate to this group and that group and the other group. And it's like, no, we need a unified single movement to propel. We need a diversity in thought, but unity in action. And with too many people pulling the movement in too many different directions, you'll just have a very shaky ship, and it won't be able to navigate to the right place. So all basically what I'm trying to say with that is leftist, liberal and centrist elements that enter into like a proletarian movement are bound to introduce revisionist bullcrap into the recipe that is unneeded. So why try to appeal to them at all? I agree we should try to encourage people to be class conscious, but we shouldn't dilute our praxis for the purpose of bringing in more recruits, especially when our praxis is like direly needed in combating fascism. So you say the very practice of political violence is also antithetical to any kind of egalitarian system that a leftist group would want to create. But, you know, politics in and of itself is a discussion on who gets to inflict violence on who. Um, the very the very nature of a stratified society necessitates a certain level of political violence. After all, our current system is enforced through violence. The bourgeoisie using the police to violently suppress any kind of proletariat uprising that may happen. And so the current system we're in is a system of constant, perpetual violence. And so, once again, the burden of violence is not necessarily on the left in this endeavor. When the proletarian revolution comes around, it's not offensive violence, but defensive violence. It's violence in retaliation to the decades and in some cases centuries of oppression that people have undergone through the capitalist system. So, and that's not to say that the revolution has to be violent. I challenge anybody to find a leftist theorist that says that the revolution must be through violence. There's a lot of different ways that the proletarian revolution can come about, and it's unfortunate that violence seems to be the most likely way. And because the capitalists are so reluctant to give up their hoard of wealth, they're so reluctant and hesitant to give up the means of production, and they would be willing to even burn down the ship rather than see it turned over to somebody else, the common people. And so, a lot of these big capitalists are willing to fight, fight viciously to hold on to the means of production. And so the proletarian movement has to be willing to engage in violence because the capitalists are certainly willing to engage in violence. They're even pretty much likely to engage in violence. I really don't see, realistically speaking, I don't see an instance where the big capitalists sit down with the proletarian movement and they just willingly give up their power without some kind of a bloody fight. It's unfortunate that that had to happen, but I just don't see any other way around it. So most of the socialist theorists out there, like Lenin, wouldn't want violence to happen, but prepared for the inevitable. And you're not gonna consolidate any kind of holdings that the proletarian revolution takes if you're not prepared to fight to defend it. So uh, that was kind of a lot to unpack with that first paragraph, but in part 5, we'll go over the rest. And from what I've established here in this part, it should be fairly easier to go point by point from here on out. So thank you for watching.